We're taking a live look now at a Paris suburb just north of Paris called Saint-Denis. Earlier today, there was a massive raid in that town. You can't tell now because people are going about their business, but I'm sure there is quite a police presence even now. Senior writer for Politico Europe, Pierre Briançon, joins us on the phone now. Pierre, can you hear us?
Yes, absolutely.
Let me ask you a little bit. We've been talking about this area of this suburb north of Paris and whether or not it's one of those so-called no-go zones and what it's like. Can you characterize Saint-Denis for us?
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as a no-go zone in either suburbs of Paris, whether they are north, south, east, or west. So this is definitely an economically challenged neighborhood, but it is also especially near Paris, a pretty middle-class neighborhood. So you have big projects. You have a lot of population from North African origin living there, among others. But I wouldn't qualify it as a no-go zone at all. On the other hand, this is a neighborhood that has suffered through, of course, from the recession, that has seen some rebellions or demonstrations against the police in the past. So it's kind of a lively and restless neighborhood, I'd call it, yes.
What is the unemployment rate like there, Pierre?
Sorry?
The unemployment rate.
I have no idea, but it's probably much higher than it is in Paris and much higher than it is overall in France. So overall in France, we're looking at 10.5% of the population. I think in the suburbs, you're looking closer to 13, 14%.
Pierre, I know you're in Paris, Pierre. I just was wondering if you had heard anything more regarding the details that officials gave about the number of arrests, also no word on identities. Are there any additional details coming from officials at this hour?
No, the officials are keeping the details close to the vest, and all we have is some media reports that, for example, Reuters said the attackers that were either killed or arrested this morning were planning an attack on the business center called La Défense, which is west of Paris. It might have been a possibility, but the authorities haven't confirmed that. They haven't confirmed that the police assault was geared at arresting or more, if I may, the man who's presented as being the mastermind of the Friday the 13th attack, Abdelhamid Abu Daoud, who's a Belgian national who's thought to be either in Syria or Belgium, but might be in France as well. But so far, this hasn't been confirmed. All we have are the official numbers.
You know, we've heard that this so-called mastermind had at least here and there been watched by authorities. They knew his name. They were familiar with some of his activities. I'm wondering how, how people feel in Paris, hearing that this is not a guy that was flying below the radar. In fact, authorities knew that he was trouble.
Well, in the rule of law, you can surveil people, you can watch people, but you only catch them when they have done something, or when they're really preparing something that is dangerous or unlawful. And so being watched by the police doesn't mean by itself that the authorities made a mistake or dropped their guard. But, of course, there will be a lot of questions in the days and weeks to come on what did the intelligence service know, whether they could have prepared better for it. This is still pretty much a question mark, although a lot of people seem to have a lot of certainties about this. That said, just being surveilled and watched by police, or just being controlled by police, like one of the attackers, one of the Friday attackers, was at the border between Belgium and France, doesn't in itself mean that the police failed in its mission.
I wonder, Pierre, you're there in Paris, and even as we've seen images of people mourning, we've also seen, obviously, the images from early this morning of the police raid in Saint-Denis. Are people in France generally satisfied with the response by authorities and also their leadership? Because we have seen François Hollande come out very forcefully since the attack on Friday the 13th and talk about the steps that he is taking to try and ensure that there will not be another ISIS attack.
We're still under the shock of Friday night's attacks. And so now is definitely not the time for people to wonder whether the government is doing enough or has been doing enough since the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January to do that, although some politicians are trying, of course, to use the opportunity to criticize the government. So far, people are more rallying behind President François Hollande because he has prepared some steps and has announced some steps to try to prevent such events in the future. And so for the moment, we're still in the, I would call it almost the national union phase of the political reaction.
And keeping that in mind, you know, the president also announced that he would like to extend the state of emergency 3 months, which seems like a long time. I'm wondering what the attitude is towards that. How do French people feel about being under a state of emergency potentially for 3 months?
Well, it depends on whether the government actually uses the powers of the state of emergency. What they want to do is to be able to use a few extraordinary powers that are granted the government under the state of emergency. That said, the reason one of the reasons Hollande has requested a 3-month extension, which has to be approved by Parliament, is that in the meantime he wants to change the constitution and make things clearer in terms of what are the powers that the government can use. So he wants to clean up the constitution to make it clearer and to protect individual and civil liberties better in case of extraordinary circumstances. For the moment, it's still pretty fuzzy. And for example, the state of emergency is not in the constitution. It's a law dating back from 1955, which of course at the time you couldn't allow the police to seize computers, for example, of terrorists, if only because computers didn't exist.
Pierre, what are the special powers? Under French law there, a state of emergency means what for police and what it is that they are able to do, as opposed to being in a regular sort of state, a non-state of emergency?
It has mostly to do with more powers giving the police on administrative powers and investigative judges to search people's houses and to seize and to keep them even without any warrant. This has mostly to do with it. There is a clause, for example, that allows the government. Also, it allows the government to ban demonstrations in whichever region of the country they deem necessary, without control by Parliament, just by a government decree. It also gives keep in mind all this theoretically, government the power to censor the press and the media if they feel it's necessary. So all these are kind of, first of all, it's the first time it has been used in the last 50 years, and second, again, it's still pretty fuzzy, and so that's why Hollande wants to codify the whole thing.
So searching, I just want to be sure I'm clear here. Under the state of emergency, police in France do not need a search warrant in order to enter a premises and search it.
No, I didn't say that. They need a search warrant.
They do use a search warrant.
It's not called a search warrant, but they can do it day or night, which, in normal periods, you can't search people's houses at night.
I see. So they can go and conduct searches at night, something that they would not normally be able to do. But there's also censorship of the press and media as well.
Well, it's the possibility giving the government in some cases to do that, and mostly banning demonstrations and being able, also, I forgot to mention, being able to use the army to fight against terrorism.
When's the last time a state of emergency was instituted like this?
By a law that was passed in 1955.
Okay. Pierre Briançon, thank you so much.
My pleasure.